Well, first of all, I love the sunflowers. Reminds me of when I was in the monastery, we had our own garden and we composted well, so every summer I'd grow these sunflowers 11 feet tall. I loved the exuberance, the exuberance of life, and that's a bit what I'll be talking about today. In the Times last week, they have a conservative columnist, Ross Douthat, I'm not quite sure how to say his name, but that's already something. We should at least occasionally listen to or read people of other persuasions than our own, politically or social, whatever, just so we don't wind up living in a bubble the same way we accuse the other side of doing. So. Besides, it really is a good exercise to get out of ourselves, which is what spiritual traditions are trying to get us to do. But he spoke, as you would expect, about tradition and passing on traditions, and it is an important issue. He was speaking about it in terms of America, the traditions of the country. And interestingly enough, I'm sure the editors intended this. There was another article in the same Sunday Review by another person about, what is our tradition, politically and in the nation. Well, of course, tradition and the lack of it or the honoring of it is a major issue obviously for religious traditions, as well as for individuals, for us as individuals. So I'd like to talk about that today. Now, no one can be a teacher in a spiritual tradition and not be conservative. No one can be a teacher in a spiritual tradition and not be fundamentally conservative, because that's what we're passing on. We, of course, pass on the apostolic tradition, the Christian tradition over many centuries. And when I was installed as a sensei, we read the names of all the masters down through history from the Buddha on. So it's important to have a tradition and to know our tradition and its place and how it works. However, just today, and of course this is all synchronistic, just today there was a quote in the Page-a-Day calendar from Alan Watts, famous Alan Watts. The more a thing tends to be permanent, the more it tends to be lifeless. Okay, so, and that is true. So, how do we avoid the permanency of tradition that would render it lifeless, and ourselves lifeless in the process? Now, there was, and I've preached on this in my Catholic homilies. There was a famous book written in the 50s, I believe, by a French Dominican theologian called Tradition and Traditions. Tradition with a capital T, the source of revelation, the main message, which is passed on, which is what we want to keep. And then the traditions with a small t and in the plural, which are, the cultural accretions, the ruts, the things that can be good, but we can get a little too attached to because they're not essential, but they're comforting to a certain extent for a certain time to some people. And there that's where we have to be careful it doesn't become lifeless. That on that level, these things shouldn't be permanent. But that can happen, and it happens also in Buddhism and any other traditions. What is merely cultural and therefore not permanent, transitory, in terms of the basic tradition. A very good example of this, I think, in both Buddhism and Christianity is language and chant and garb. There are those in the Catholic tradition that think, if you're not singing in Latin and don't have the certain type of vestments, that it's not what it should be. It's not the tradition. Well, that isn't the tradition. I'm sorry. It's just those are accretions. Those are flowerings, but they're not what is basic. Same thing in American Buddhists, American Zen Buddhists, you can have people who have to be in robes and sing and chant in Japanese for hours at a time. Okay, as long as you're not identifying that with the big T tradition in either one. Because ironically, what the traditions, and I say traditions with a big T, the Buddhism or Christianity, what they do point to is that things change. So if you want to hold on to something permanent, the permanent message is that things aren't permanent. Especially in Buddhism, of course. We have the content of the tradition, in other words, is that things change and that things are dynamic and that things need to grow, which is, of course, what life teaches anyway, which is why it's also the spiritual teaching. So we can miss the mark, which is one of the definitions of sin, if we are holding on to, clinging to things, which we shouldn't be clinging to. And that, of course, is the noble truths. Life is suffering, the first noble truth. Life is inadequate, but a large amount of the suffering we cause ourselves because we're clinging to something that we should let go of, or we want something that we don't have, and we're not content with inconsistency. And of course, the great metaphysical propositions of Buddhism, anicca, anatta, dukkha, that things are insubstantial and impermanent, and that's the permanent message. Is that things are impermanent, and they will change, and you will cause the fair suffering. The noble truth, will be not honored, or it will be violated if you don't learn to let go. If you don't let the impermanent be impermanent, and then discover in the midst of that acceptance, what is, and which is what will happen if you let go, So the more it tends to be lifeless if it's permanent. And of course, life is change, as is often said. Growth is change. Growth is life. I think Cardinal Newman said something like that. That if to grow is to change, and to be holy is to change often. In other words, to go with that flow and to allow life to be itself. That very much is the message. And then, compared to, for example, the notion of stability, it's actually a monastic vow, as you know, which I took myself for a while in the Catholic tradition. Stability, in other words, to be rooted in one place, to have that permanence there, in order for you to expand. How does that actually work? And what are you expanding, and how do you expand? There's actually a phrase in the Carthusian rule which says, how can you focus on the one thing necessary, on the one important thing, if your body's not rooted in one place? In other words, living in a monastery for your whole life. Well, of course, that's absurd. That doesn't follow at all. However, so what does the stability, we do want a stability, right? A stability in the practice, a stability in intention, a stability which leads to what? A stability in growth, a stability in change, a stability in movement, forward, upward. That's the ironic thing. We do need stability in that. In fact, I edited a book of Carthusian sermons just before I left the monastery, and one of them that I chose was on stability. It was preached by the Father General for the solemn monastic profession of one of my close friends in France, and it was on stability, and I put that in the book because it's stability in the resurrection. What we're stable in is this continued growth and continued change and continued expansion of our heart and mind. So it's not something which stays the same, and there, as if something eternal, and this is Eckhart Tolle, of course, very much, as if something eternal was something that didn't change. On the contrary, it's just totally alive. We've had a lot of trouble with this in the West, trying to make human nature or divine nature or nature itself, totally stable. Speaking of substance, I'm a substance, I'm a thing, it's already given, it's right here, plunked down, Whereas human nature is continued change. Or as one person put it once, we're just a whirlwind, a continued whirlwind of energy, going in all sorts of directions unless we learn how to channel it. But that's the kind of vitality which is there, which is who we are. We're a verb and not a noun. And that's obviously true, especially in talking about theology of the Trinity, which is continued movement, which is a dynamism, which is continued vitality and creativity and freedom and joy. So until we get that notion of this continued dynamism, then we won't really be in touch with reality itself. The Japanese Zen Buddhist Masao Abe has a concept also. It fits in with this dynamic shunyata, which is the emptiness is dynamic. The emptiness is not something. It's not just motionlessness. It's dynamic. That's the very nature of reality itself. So if you want to hold on to a fundamental message that's permanent, it should be about constant and limitless vitality. Stability in that. So growth and change and life is what we're really looking for. Another aspect of this, and this is the actual page-a-day thing which inspired me for this talk already last week by someone named Henry Adams. Chaos often breeds life when order breeds habit. A lot of dimensions to that. Chaos often breeds life when order breeds habit. Now, if you're following order and doing the same thing every day, following a rule or whatever it might be, you can get into a rut and just be doing it by rote and not really be enthusiastic about it. But not necessarily. Order can bring a habit, and in Western theology and philosophy in the Middle Ages, habit, or Aristotle, habit is something good. If it's something good that is a habit, not smoking, but being generous, then it becomes easy and joyous, and that's what true virtue is. So habit can be a good thing, but if habit becomes a rut, and the order becomes an excuse for not living, and for not facing the challenges of growth and creativity and change, then it's a rut, then it's a trap. Mm-hmm. Whereas, and I think you find this in your daily life, if you have a certain order, certain things you do in a certain way every day, it can become a rut, or it can be a liberating thing, done well, in the right proportion, where you don't have to worry, concentrate on where you put your toothbrush, you just do it, and allows you to be free to live it, to be fully, you don't have to worry about the mechanics, you just do it, and that can be tremendously liberating. So there is that. However, if your whole life, 365 days a year, is just the daily order, well, you're going to wind up in a rut. I mean, there's no, I dare you to prove me wrong. So you need vacation, you need change, you need the challenge of a new atmosphere, of a whole new thing to see or be, or places to go. In order to sharpen your taste for life, to make you realize that within your little world you're not necessarily seeing it all. I mean, you might, if you're really enlightened, the whole universe is present at your fingertips as you drink your coffee in the morning. But until then, go to Tahiti or something, and you'll get a sense of the expansiveness, of the possibilities, of life, and get a taste, maybe sharpen your taste for things that you might have lost a taste for, or get new tastes. And And chaos can breed life. It's not exactly the same thing. There's a famous phrase from William Blake, that the road to excess leads to the palace of wisdom. Okay, again, not smoking, but well, no, you can learn from your, if you mean learn from your mistakes, you're excessive. This is not a good philosophy if you're following the middle path, as Aristotle and the Buddha teach, following the middle path rather than excess in either way. But you can learn from your mistakes, that's one meaning of it. But also, just a little chaos, if you mean it in that sense, can be great. Because it can destabilize your ego and your ability to control, and your need to control, and you're just kind of floating and surrendering to life, and that can be tremendously instructive and helpful to the palace of wisdom. And there is, someone sent me a quote from Chesterton. He always has a good way of, a very sparkly way of saying some of these things, usually very down to earth in his English way. It fits in with what we're talking about today. This is what he writes. All conservatism is based upon the idea that if you leave things alone, you leave them the way they are. But you don't. If you leave a thing alone, you leave it to a torrent of change. That's the Buddhist doctrine of impermanence. Whatever is going to change. If you leave a white post alone, it will soon be a black post. If you particularly want it to be white, you must always be painting it again. That is, you must always be having a revolution. So those who really want things to stay the same have to do violence to life. A revolution in that sense. Briefly, if you want the old white post, you must have a new white post. So that's a very English take on it. So in both these traditions, in Buddhism and Christianity, we have a stable tradition which is all about change and growth and vitality and creativity. Because that's what reality is. So as long as we're firmly attached to that message of non-attachment, then we'll be okay. Reminds me of someone who accused Cardinal Danielou, an atheist, of saying, Cardinal Danielou, well, you're so attached to the cross, And he said, yeah, but the cross isn't attached to anything. So if you really embrace a spiritual tradition, that will liberate you, as long as the tradition with a capital T and not the little t's, which are a tease. Final quote, which I happened to read, again, synchronicity, just before I came here today over at Starbucks. And I'm reading a book called Unmasking the Powers on the Angelic Forces by a Catholic theologian from the 80s, Walter Wink. And this brings us right back to America. He's speaking about the angels of the nations and the angels of America. Kind of like angels in America, by the way. Not so different. This is what the angel of America might say, he suggests. A vision of a nation free of poverty and hunger, a nation of opportunity, a nation where the creative novelty of the divine will is for the first time in human history celebrated and preferred. A nation which attracts other nations toward freedom rather than imposing it on them. A nation of persons liberated from the tyranny of convention, able to pursue their own creative ways. Well, that's where you see the best of America rejoining these traditions of creativity and freedom. If we do live it out and allow others to live it out, even on the political level. But certainly on the spiritual level, the psychological level, the social level, the individual level, we need to hold firm to that wonderful message that everything is wonderful because it's growing and changing, including us.